hit record so that we can have this available for our YouTube channel. Yay. So we're just
forgot to tell you to record, so I'm glad you remembered.
That's okay. This is the one thing that I forget almost all the time with my private clients as well as in my groups is the record. So I'm like, someone needs to hold me accountable and I'll hold you accountable for other things. Okay, so I was just telling Anya, I always get the energetic throat every time before we go live. And so I have my 5 beverages here just in case. That's a real
All right, you guys, we're coming on in about 15 seconds. So you guys have a great show.
Thank you, Gabe.
Empowerment and come back every day to see what's next.
Welcome to Women Thriving Unapologetically with Lynsie McKeown. Over the next hour, you will hear raw, honest, and inspiring conversation between Lynsie and her guests, discussing how to thrive, live joyfully, and abundantly in spite of life's challenges. Now, here is your host, Lynsie McKeown.
Hello, and welcome to Women Thriving Unapologetically. I am your host, Lynsie McKeown. And this is a sanctuary for you to land every single week and feel seen, heard, and appreciated through the inspiring and powerfully honest conversations with women like you. And I'm extremely excited about our guest for today. But before we invite her onto the show, let's take a moment to stop, pause, and connect. So wherever you are, just place one or both hands on your lower belly, just below the navel. And if you're in a place where you can do so, just simply close your eyes and let's take several deep breaths all the way down into your belly. These deep, full belly breaths so that you can feel the belly expand into your hands with each inhale. And you can feel that soft hugging in with each exhale. And as we take these deep, full belly breaths, we're inviting the body to come into a more restful state, a place where we can be more present, more aware, but we're also inviting the breath into this area of the body that stores our memories, our belief systems, and even those memories that are tied to our past. So one more deep breath in and out. And then just gently making your way back. And we will invite our guest to the show, who is known in this lifetime by Anya Shepelavey. And I have known Anya personally for several years. And what I love about her is her devotion and courage to dive into the soul in pursuit of inner peace, self-acceptance, unconditional love, and wholeness. Now, Anya was thrust onto the path of spiritual awakening while living in Oregon, pursuing her master's degree in international public health. Anya's then husband was diagnosed with a life-threatening heart condition, which set her on a path to explore alternative health treatments in an effort to help him heal. His medical issues triggered traumas, inspiring Anya over the years to take up yoga. So it triggered these unconscious memories of her own personal and generational and past life traumas, which inspired her to take up the yoga, meditation, and other spiritual and healing practices. And this helped her relieve the overwhelm, anxiety, and panic she was experiencing. And her transformational life journey has facilitated an intimate understanding of the karmic thread that she has been healing and has guided Anya into a beautiful heart opening and a welcome return to her true and divine nature. Along the way, Anya has become a certified forest yoga teacher, a Nia white belt teacher, a motion code practitioner, and has completed her shamanic healing training and become a certified angel guide. So I'm so happy to have you here today, Anya. Thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Lynsie. It's really great to be in conversation with you.
Yes, we have Anya and
We
I
have a
have been
lot.
having very deep conversations for many years now, especially over the pandemic. We started sending voice memos to each other. Like she would send me one and then I would respond and send her one as a check-in with each other. And what happened is we started to really hear how our stories were unraveling and these great insights that were coming from our spiritual practices. And we have different spiritual practices that support us. So it was interesting to see what she was doing or hear what she was doing. And she got to hear what I was doing. And we got to offer each other insights from our own perspective and to just be a sounding board. And it ended up being this beautiful, beautiful support system. At least it was definitely for me.
Me too, for sure.
To really help work through some of the trauma that was presenting itself through the deeper inner work that we were doing and through that time of the pandemic. And today we actually want to talk a little bit about trauma, but more how it relates to war, Ukraine, and just healing that cycle of intergenerational trauma. And so, Anya, as being an American-born Ukrainian, your family is no stranger to war. And I would love for us to start off by you sharing your incredible story, your family's connection to the Ukraine. Is that okay with you?
Yes, and I will say we leave out the. We say Ukraine and not
Oh,
the
Ukraine.
Ukraine.
Oh, you
Yeah,
told me that before the show
I
and I still
know
did it.
it's a really big sticking point with all Ukrainians, but anyhow,
No, I
yeah,
appreciate that. So it's
understandable.
not, so just to clarify, it's not the Ukraine, it's
It's
Ukraine.
Ukraine. Yeah.
It's Ukraine. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Part of my upbringing is like, remembering parents and people in my community writing letters to the editor, like to news stations, like leave out the, but anyhow. So my parents and grandparents fled Ukraine in 1943, both sides of my family. And on my mother's side, my mother was 7 years old when they fled. Both my families are from Western Ukraine, and there was an invasion of the Soviets and the Nazis. So my mother's family fled when my mother was 7 years old, and they went westward, ended up in displaced persons camps in Germany, and then immigrated to the United States in 1951. So my mother left when she was 7 and arrived in the US when she was 13. And on my father's side, they left in the same year in 1943. Also, it was like a 7-year journey. My father was 13 when they left and 20 when they arrived in the United States. And I grew up in a community of Ukrainian people, because of the threat of the war, because the Soviets were coming in and basically trying to do away with our whole culture. It really sort of it was like my grandparents and parents and the community we ended up in. It was really put upon us to continue the culture, the language, the history, the religion, and all that. It was like on our shoulders and our responsibility to kind of continue it forward. But and so that's primarily how I grew up, like really entrenched in the Ukrainian culture because of that. But at that time, like Ukrainians, I think were really, really driven, like they self-organized in these displaced persons camps. They immigrated to communities that were already present. So their adaptation to US culture or any culture was pretty good given their circumstances. But at that time, like nobody was really talking about trauma or PTSD. I think it was sort of culturally considered indulgent to talk about emotions. Like Ukrainians have that drive to like keep pursuing what's next. And, I think people were in survival mode. I would say as a general whole in the United States, when I was growing up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, any kind of talk about therapy was sort of like taboo or not considered normal. And that language and the opportunity to kind of do therapy wasn't considered acceptable probably until the 90s, in my opinion, because that's when I started therapy. But I want to backtrack a little bit just to the experiences my family's had, like in this trajectory of fleeing war, just the trauma of like being sort of like pushed out of your own country is traumatic in and of itself. And each family sort of had their own trauma that they experienced. On my mother's side, they fled. My maternal grandmother was actually Estonian, but she was living in Ukraine. And so they had family in Eastern Europe. I can't remember which country they were in. It might have been Czechoslovakia that they initially fled to, and like lived temporarily with a family and like 20 other people in like a 2-bedroom house. My mom had stories of like, blacking out the shades and or blacking out the windows, and air raids or air sirens, to like for bomb raids. But what happened was they found out that like the front, whatever it was, the Nazi front or the Soviets were moving further west, and they just felt like it was safe to leave and continue going further west. And at the border, they conscripted my grandfather. So my grandfather couldn't leave with the rest of the family. He had to stay behind. So that was like one fragmentation and separation of family. So my mother and her sister and their mother and grandmother continued westward to like further to Western Europe. And they ended up in Germany in a displaced persons camp. And when my mother was 9 years old, her mother died of a brain hemorrhage. Like she suddenly had a brain hemorrhage. She collapsed in front of my mother, only lived a few days, and they couldn't track down my grandfather to get him to come to be by her side. So essentially my mother and her sister were orphaned for a time being. And I think my grandfather, I don't know how long it took for him to get the news and figure out how to extricate himself from the situation that he was in, but he ultimately joined up with them. And then they immigrated to the US. And I recently, this year, found out that when they were leaving Germany to go to the United States, they actually had to leave. My mother and her sister had to leave their grandmother behind, which I didn't know. So there were all these points of like separation and fragmentation of the family, unexpected events, like traumatic events, especially for a 7-year or 9-year-old to lose her mother. That was like extremely traumatizing.
So much uncertainty and fear.
Fear, and just the, constantly moving, not knowing where you're going to end up, not knowing, how long it's going to take to get somewhere where it's safe, that kind of thing. And on my father's side, my dad was from a very small farming rural village, and his father was very sort of like civically minded. He was like on the just sort of like local governance and helping people who were sort of underserved. He started like a farming cooperative for farmers to share farming tools because they couldn't afford tools. And he had also started a fund to help out families who were descendants of, there was a collective famine that Stalin created in the 30s in Ukraine, and like millions of Ukrainians perished. And my grandfather started a fund to help support these families. Well, the Soviets had like lists of people who who were doing these types of things. And my grandfather was on that list. And he had already been imprisoned for some reason prior to this, but the Soviets arrested my grandfather and sent him like thousands of miles away to Eastern Russia, leaving my grandmother with like a baby, my 7-year-old uncle and my 10-year-old father to like care for the family on her own. She was very capable, she was from that village. She was very capable in her ability to like sustain the family with food, farming and all that kind of stuff. But I think it was just terrifying for her to know that at any point there could be a raid, and that like her family was compromised, or they might come and take her children. So my father had stories of like my grandmother sending him to a neighbor's house and asking my father to knock on their door to ask if he could sleep in their barn, because she was afraid of having all the children together in case there was a raid, like so that, they wouldn't all be taken together. But my grandfather, by some miracle, made it back alive. And then, they kind of had the same trajectory, like they were also in these refugee camps. But I know my grandmother kind of had issues with my grandfather sort of like being so engaged in sort of community efforts, like he wasn't kind of participating in supporting the family enough. And I think there were some instances of her just feeling like in those moments where he's arrested and not there, feeling like, in my greatest time of need. I think my other grandmother probably experienced this too, like in the most traumatic situation possible, my spouse, my person, my partner isn't here to support me through the most difficult aspect of this.
Yeah.
And I feel like that kind of trauma is sort of like what started to reverberate in my own life.
So
But
I mean,
that's,
just
yeah.
listening to the story, I mean, like there's so many layers to it. And it's
Mhm.
not just on one side of your family, but it's on your father's side and your mother's side. And any one instance that you've explained
Mhm.
is powerful, but there are so many instances where there's no stability, there's no
Mhm.
sense of security or certainty for your physical well-being, much less,
Yeah.
just being able to provide a home, food, shelter,
Yeah.
making sure that you can keep your family, you and your family safe. These are all
Mhm.
just basic needs that we take very much for granted, and
Mhm.
don't understand that when those are taken away, that it can have an incredible impact on the nervous systems,
Mhm.
not just of those that are experiencing it, but but how they pass those experiences on. So how
Also
did you?
fearing for their lives. My
Yeah.
father saw, as a boy, he saw Nazis killing Jews in his village. Like,
Mm.
the impact of that on a child was great,
Yeah. When we talk
yeah.
about PTSD and, how that PTSD is really when you have a significant emotional event,
Hmm.
and that significance can vary. It can be a small T trauma or a big T trauma, but all of these were big T traumas
Yeah, big,
that
right.
your family was experiencing. And that if you're not addressing that, like you said, the therapy and understanding what is happening in our nervous systems and our minds, that if it's not healed, it can get passed on. And so how did you first recognize the patterns in you that were tied to, generations before you?
I would say, to talk about generational trauma, it's hard to distinguish between what's your personality. Like I realized after a certain time that a lot of us are walking around expressing through the filter of intergenerational trauma so much more than we realize. So for me, it took a long time of evolving through my healing to recognize that there was intergenerational trauma also, sort of like as a layer or a filter through my experience. And mostly it was through two significant events. One, when my ex-husband was diagnosed with that life-threatening heart condition, I was like living in abject terror from the moment that diagnosis came. And it was like energy that was larger than me and beyond my control. Like it felt like complete helplessness and like obsessive worry all the time that he was going to die. Like, especially in that first year, like every day, literally, I was like, he's going to die, like within the year. And then the second one being like when he and I went through our divorce, like we started that process like 7 years ago, and realizing like that process of divorce involves separation of children, separation of family,
Mhm.
and not realizing until after the fact that all that my grandparents and grandmothers especially went through with like having family members separated, that was kicking stuff up. So it wasn't until, because we'd been together since we were 18, my ex-husband and I. So there was a lot that was sort of wrapped into that relationship that hadn't been examined, that was kicked up. And I feel like just those threads of intergenerational trauma, of the fear of separation, fear of being alone, fear of being without a partner, not understanding how to like handle this like traumatic life event, all those things I feel like were what got triggered.
So you're having your own, traumatic event in your life, which
Mhm.
needs to be, experienced and processed, but at the same time, it's tapping into some unresolved trauma from your family's history that makes what
Yes.
you're experiencing even more powerful, and almost, it
Mhm.
sounds almost overwhelming. And it was
Mhm.
difficult to decide, well, is this mine? Or you said that it was bigger than you.
Yes.
You were
And
starting to sense that.
definitely, like, especially when my ex-husband was diagnosed, like his heart situation went on for 12 years. And it was very much like one moment we're fine. And the next moment, the rug's getting pulled out from underneath of us, which again, way later after like he was healed, I started to understand that that energy sort of was coming from what my parents and grandparents went through of like sudden change, like significant life change. So in some sense, looking back on it, I felt like my ex-husband and I were sort of living through a war of our own. And it was almost like in hindsight that I understood that there was layers of generational trauma. And it really did feel like a larger force of energy that was constantly like pressing on me. And I kind of always was internalizing feeling that it's something about me that's not right. like personally
Yeah.
blaming myself for things. But it took a long time. I would say that I really just started to process through the intergenerational trauma like within the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this is so powerful already in what we're talking about, and that a lot of the experiences that we're having in our lives can be very much trigger things that are not even ours to carry, but are ours.
Mhm.
But until we address them and process them, what will happen is we could pass those on to the next generation. So we do have to go to our first break of the show. So I'd love when we come back to talk about, how, one, how do you recognize that it's intergenerational trauma? And two, what do we do to start to heal that so that we're not passing that on to the next generation for them to have to uncover, process, and heal? How can we break those ties? And so don't go anywhere. We will be right back with Anya Shepelavey. I love just putting an accent on your name.
Time does go by so fast. It's crazy.
All right, and we're all clear.
Okay, how'd that feel?
It's great. Yeah.
Okay, good.
I was just like, oh my God, the break's coming up already. Holy moly.
It goes by very, very quickly.
Yes.
So yes, when we come, we go back, I'd love just to, because there's so much to cover.
Yeah.
With that background, it was a great background. If we can now just kind of flesh out a little bit, okay, how do we recognize it? Like, how do we know that? That's a big question that might take, we won't have the time to unpack fully, but just to touch on that some. And then, some of the methods that we can do to heal some of those wounds, because, and emphasizing, why it's important, I think. I mean, because, who wants to unpack all that? And if we understand why it's so important, not just for our lives, but for our children's lives or the next generations, and how that can have a bigger impact, would be awesome to dive into. Does that sound like a path?
Yes.
Okay. You're doing great. Relaxed, clear.
All right, you guys, we're coming right back.
Okay.
It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You're listening to Women Thriving Unapologetically with Lynsie McKeown. Have a question for Lynsie or her guests? Want to share your story? Email Lynsie at thrivingunapologetically@gmail.com. That's thrivingunapologetically@gmail.com. Now back to the show. Here again is Lynsie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Thriving Unapologetically on Voice America's Empowerment Channel. And me, your host, Lynsie McKeown. I'm here today with Anya Shepelavey, and we're talking about war, Ukraine, and healing the cycle of intergenerational trauma. So we're going to dive right back in to our conversation. And I'd love to hear, Anya, how did you recognize, how can we recognize when what's showing up in our lives is related to the trauma of our ancestors, and how can we, and what are the tools that we can use to start to heal that? And why is that important? I just gave you 3 questions, so we'll start with the first.
3 large questions.
Let's start with recognizing.
Well, I will be honest, it took me years to understand that what I was experiencing was, I feel like it's everything, right? We have our own personal traumas layered on top of intergenerational trauma, and I'm going to throw in past life trauma because I had all 3 of those happening at once. And for me, what I know is the experience of like when we're beginning to examine trauma, sometimes what happens is we're just experiencing the emotion and we feel like we're almost inside of it, and we don't even have the room to know that there's another way through it because we're sort of taken over by the emotions. And in the work I've done and the healing work I've done is sort of clearing that energy in various ways through various tools. Like for me, it was therapy, body-oriented psychotherapy, the type of yoga that I did, learning breath work and being present with my body and stalking and tracking energy in my body so I could identify where the emotions were living inside my body, as a stuck place or a contraction or pain or whatever it was, and then learning to sit with those feelings with my breath, with my body, and go towards the discomfort rather than trying to move away from it.
Going towards
Right.
discomfort can be really scary too.
Yeah,
And so,
right. But
yeah,
I had teachers and people that created containers for me to know and learn how to do that really safely, right? So that was really an important process. And I feel like the process started with me, with sort of like uh, removing all those uh, sort of filters and I don't even know what to call them. It was like living inside the emotions, sort of clearing all that stuff out through being held in a safe container by others was what started the process of being able to clear it enough so I could be a witness to my own experience rather than being sort of entrenched in it.
yeah, and taken
Um,
over by the experience it sounds. So let me just recap real quick for everyone is that, so what I'm hearing is that one, you had to have the courage to go get help. That it's like first you have to be willing to work with what's right there at the surface that's happening for you in that moment. And then having that container, having someone that's, qualified to support you and helping to process those emotions so that you can step outside of that experience and become more the witness. And,
mhm.
and then you're not being so identified with the emotions that you're not so tied into it and being kind of thrashed about by them, but you can actually start to have some, um, I don't like to use the word control, but you have some,
Well, in a way, I kind of feel like it is regaining authority over yourself
yeah,
because one of the principles of shamanism is that we are meant to live in wholeness. And what happens when we are birthed into this reality in this lifetime, we lose pieces of ourselves. That's sort of the process of our life experience. Like we come in with a free soul and a physical soul, and we lose pieces of that soul. So any kind of wounding that we have, whether it's like an accident, like issues within our family, we start to fragment, right? So we move out of wholeness into these fragmented parts or into these wounded parts. And then we're living our lives through the filter of those wounds. And when we start to do healing work in whatever capacity it is that you're doing it, for me, it was various types of therapy. Like I said, body-oriented psychotherapy, the embodied or like somatic experiencing in yoga and working with the emotions at the same time and working with the breath. When you start to heal those parts, it's like those parts that were lost return to you and you start to put yourself back towards wholeness. And when we're operating from the perspective of a whole person, it's like we're anchoring ourselves in our being, and we're grounding ourselves. And then that's what gives us the ability to have that perspective. But when we're operating from a wounded place, we're very much like, I feel like from a wounded perspective, that's when we're subject to the filters of our own trauma, the filters of intergenerational trauma, and we're seeing and viewing the world through very, very limited perspective from a wounded perspective, right? And I consider that sort of a contracted, fragmented state. And when we're operating from that space, we're not well resourced. We're not well resourced. And so we're not in a space to like be creative with how to deal with the situation, right? That's when we're in a reactive state. That's when we're more likely to kind of create damage, because whatever space we're operating out of, we're operating in the with subconscious emotions and things that are hidden from us, and our reactions will tend to go sideways and cause peripheral damage, right?
Causing another accident, it sounds like.
Yeah, but when we've kind of resumed those pieces of ourselves, and so like in shamanism, that's why we learn past life regression, inner child healing, journey work, reclaiming like your own power and figuring out like the what your power source is. You bring all those pieces back to yourself, and it's like you create enough of a centering, grounding core aspect of yourself that you sort of like expand your resources to be able to see energies or experience energies in a broader capacity. And then that gives you space to kind of have a moment to respond to a situation rather than to react. Does that make sense?
I mean, it's beautiful. I love how well you just explain this whole process, because like what you said about living our lives through the filter of wounds, and not just our wounds, but also those of our predecessors. So it's like, wow. So and that leaves us with a fragmented perspective. And in doing that, I love what you said about not being well resourced. And so we're not able to really, and this is what I'm thinking is that, and I would love your opinion on this, is that if we're not well resourced and we're seeing through the lens of our personal wounds and our generational wounds, then we're not able to really see clearly what new solutions can come through, because we're only drawing from our past and we're only drawing from our pain.
That's the only answer.
That's why we repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. And see that happening in our personal lives and the lives of our friends and the lives of our countries. And
and I want to add something to that, because like sometimes that's the only thing we know, though. That's the only experience we have. So like the tricky part is like when we're born into this, we come in with these filters. It's the only thing we know. We don't have any contrast to know anything, we don't have anything to compare it to. So part of my healing process was like pulling pieces of myself back together again and having a different experience, which then I could use in comparison to like my, what I was normally doing, and realizing like, oh, there's this other state of being that I can be in that's more serene, relaxed, open, where my response mechanism is different. And then that's what I want to aspire to, right? And then that sort of creates the desire and to keep going with the healing process. And I lost my train of thought.
So let me ask you this. So if we don't know any better, so to speak, when we don't have any other perspective but the one that we've been taught and have experienced, what's going to be the catalyst to make us want to change? Because if this is what we know and we're comfortable in this known version of ourselves, why would we want to step outside of that? Like, what is going to be the catalyst?
Yeah, well, for me, it had to be huge, right? It had to be a life-threatening experience, because maybe the life-threatening thing was the trauma that was passed down to me through generations. And it's something that like really knocks you off your feet and creates significant amounts of pain and suffering that's unbearable. Like that's what it was for me. I couldn't tolerate the experience of the fear that I was experiencing, and I had to seek something to like offset that fear. I didn't have the tools, and I went looking for tools to help me. And for me, the first thing was yoga, because I was trying to exercise my way out of that fear, and just exercising harder and harder wasn't doing it. It wasn't like offsetting, the trauma that was internal.
Yeah. I mean, I really feel that when you're talking about that. I was like, wow, I can feel that fear coming up, and the emotion around that.
It was so intense. And it was like, I Yeah, and after a time, like for me personally, in this particular trauma situation that I had with my ex-husband with his heart health, it was like 7 years in, and I remember like lying in my bed one day, and and I had had coaching sessions with shamans, and I'd done my yoga teacher training, so I had knowledge and experience of like subtle energies, but there were things I was missing. And I remember we had some event that we'd just been through, and I was like, is my response normal, like in the range of normal here, and I posed that question to myself, and it sort of was like, sometimes I feel like some part of us comes through to give us information, and we just have to be open enough to listen to the inner guidance. And for me, it was like, is there something else going on that's beyond my comprehension of myself?
Yeah, is this mine? Is
Is
this
this
mine?
mine? Yeah.
It's a
And
great
so,
question.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be, a good starting point for a lot of us that are experiencing these intense
hmm
um, traumas, and to say, is this solely mine, or am I carrying, or is it also triggering, some generational trauma? And am I
Yeah.
carrying, is this my mom's? Is this my grandmother's or my grandfather's that I'm also carrying? And that's just my experience is just bringing that to the surface. So,
Yeah, and think
um,
about those stories you've been told and that you know about your family. Like that's what kept doing. And
mhm.
I intellectually understood it, but it took a while for like the process to really shift internally for me. And I would say, not only like looking at, if there's some events in your life that are really throwing you off track or like really giving you a challenging time, and it's like something that you're just having a lot of trouble overcoming. And, it's the patterns. Like, are these patterns repeating themselves in your life and
Mhm.
showing up in your life for one, over and over and over again?
Yeah, and so if it's happening over and over and over again, that's a clear
hmm
sign that, okay, maybe it's time for me to investigate this a little bit more, get
hmm
some support to help me uncover why this is on repeat. What are the belief systems that are tied to this pattern that's showing up in my life? Um, and so you said that, that some of the most effective things for you were yoga and breath work, the somatic movement to help get those to the surface, and also some work in the shamanic traditions. Is there anything else that you would say is a really great tool for people to utilize or find out there that would support them?
I mean, I would say, a crucial thing was the people who were supporting me and finding people that understood the nuances of energy, that understood the language of trauma, and that like the therapist I ended up with, who was like, I was having a lot of panic attacks, and she was schooled in EMDR, which is like deals with sort of rewiring your
Mhm.
brain mechanism, but she was also had a spiritual component to her practice. So it wasn't just talk therapy, but it really involved me talking about something that's going on and then stopping the conversation and having me tune into my body and finding like whatever the conflict is that I think is up here, where is that in my body?
Because
And
it's
she really,
stored in the body, correct?
yeah. And she held that space for me and let me sit for a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes in silence when in me trying to track wherever it was in my body, and then really sitting with that feeling and her guiding the exploration
Mhm.
of that aspect. And it started to turn into internal conversations with myself, with aspects of myself that were extremely healing.
And so
So yeah.
and so when doing this work, I know we're coming up on another break, but maybe we can answer this quickly, is that in doing all of this work for yourself and also helping to heal some generational and karmic wounding,
Mm.
how can you see this being reflecting in your own children? You have two beautiful daughters, and how, they're with you for this whole journey, and how
Yeah.
is this impacting their lives?
Well, when I knew I was having kids, my ex and I really set out to raise conscious kids. So for me, the most important things were, one, knowing that they're coming in as their own individual spirits and souls, and they have their own thing going on. They're not mine. right? They're given to me and they're coming through me, and to support and like keep their spirit intact as much as possible. And that meant like really honoring and validating any feelings or emotions they're having. So anytime they're crying, I'm with them when they're crying. I'm validating that experience for them so that they don't begin to doubt their own emotions and their own feelings and their own experiences. And so it's teaching them to have authority over themselves, and that I don't dictate what they're feeling. I don't put upon them what I think is happening with them. I'm letting them be in the decision and the choice around that. Does that make sense? So
Makes absolute sense. Sounds very
yeah,
powerful, empowering for them.
yeah. And then knowing that whatever work I'm doing on myself energetically, it's naturally happening. They're inherently linked to me energetically, especially when there's babies and toddlers. Like whatever's shifting energetically in me, and also whatever's going on with me, they're tapping into.
Mhm.
So the more healing work I'm doing, and I'm coming more into wholeness with myself, more into the core of my being, I am a reflection. Like they're looking at me and seeing that I'm well resourced. That lets them off the hook so that they can focus on themselves more. And it's not even a spoken thing. And then they can see that like I don't need to hold emotional crap from my mom.
Yeah.
Right.
And
And
they,
it's
yeah.
just intuited, basically. But, also it was like having open conversations about feelings and emotions, admitting to when I made a mistake and doing repair work if there was a conflict. Like it's really just kind of living with more openness about our emotional selves, about energy. I feel like they're both very attuned to energies. I've done like energy work with them, journey work with them, validating how they experience energy in their bodies and their beings. So
It's
that's
incredible for them to have that experience, just to be, have their feelings and emotions and thoughts validated.
Mhm.
And then also, by doing that and also helping them create some self-authority for themselves, that they're not
Yeah.
going to pick up on your stuff.
Yeah.
You're doing your healing work, so they're not going, whatever that you've been carrying for all of your ancestors isn't going to be passed on to them. They get to
Yeah.
choose what they are going to carry on to the next
Yes.
generation.
Yes.
So, well, we're going to go ahead and go to our last break of the show, but don't go anywhere, because when we come back, I would really love to hear how you responded when the current war broke out in the Ukraine, and what your perspective of that is and how it ties to the divine feminine. So don't go anywhere. This is going to be juicy.
All right, we're all clear.
All clear.
And just as a reminder too, once we get a little bit closer towards the close and everything like that, just be mindful about the cues and everything too, because if you guys do go a little bit over, 58 will be like the hard cutoff. So I
Okay.
just don't want to stop you guys hard there.
Okay.
and everything.
Thank you.
Pull the reins in.
I know. So just when he gives the 1 minute mark in
Yeah.
the chat,
Give it
we'll
over
have
to you.
I'll have to be like, and then that will give me at least a minute to tie everything up and wrap up the show, maybe a minute and a half. So when you see the 2 minute mark, we'll wind it down, and then I'll go ahead and close out the show, and we can hang out a little bit longer and follow up with anything that we want. Because since we're recording it, people that watch it on YouTube or on the Facebook group can catch all the other stuff that we didn't have a chance to talk about. It's not good. It's good stuff.
I know, it really is. It's helpful to be in conversation, with it.
Yeah, it is so helpful to be in conversation. And, as I mentioned, for those of you listening in the group right now, is that, having a sounding board for what's coming up is really powerful. And, whether it's one person that, you can really feel vulnerable with and share completely and openly and honestly, like Anya and I have been able to do with each other, or in a community of women.
Dropping things into our texts, the shadow box.
The shadow box. No one else is allowed to look
All
at
right,
Here's
you
what's
guys,
going
we're
on.
coming back
There we
in
go.
about 10 seconds.
Network, its staff and management.
You're listening to Women Thriving Unapologetically with Lynsie McKeown. Have a question for Lynsie or her guests? Want to share your story? Email Lynsie at thrivingunapologetically@gmail.com. That's thrivingunapologetically@gmail.com. Now back to the show. Here again is Lynsie.
Welcome back to the show, Women Thriving Unapologetically. We are having an amazing conversation with Anya Shepelavey and on war, Ukraine, and healing the cycle of intergenerational trauma. And so we want to dive right back in because there's so much to talk about and so little time to do it. So, at the end of the last break, I asked you like to reflect on, okay, what was your response? Being American born Ukrainian with such ties to the Ukraine and the intergenerational trauma that your family endured during the World War. Like, what was your response when this current war in Ukraine broke out?
It was sort of like like reliving my entire life as a Ukrainian born in the States. It was like all the stories of my parents, grandparents, and what they went through is like, that's going to happen all over again. And really what struck me was like self-reflective. I don't know if it's selfish, but it was like, oh my God, I've just spent like 25 years untangling this trauma, my own trauma. And now there's millions of people that are going to be in the same situation. And it was like almost heartbreaking thinking about just knowing what it's like to live in that kind of pain. And then knowing this like whole culture of people are, people are going to be traumatized and they're going to need help healing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was like sort of the first thought. And there was a lot of other stuff.
Well, and
Anger, disbelief.
Anger, disbelief, and and it wasn't that
reliving history. Yeah.
Reliving history that
Didn't we already close this chapter? Yeah.
Not. It's opened again. And but as we talked about before the end of the show, it's just like there's a lot of things that are being repeated because it hasn't been healed and moving from those fragmented parts.
Yes.
And so this is just the encouragement, like, okay, we have to bring those parts back into wholeness if we really want to see a greater perspective, like pull from a greater perspective and create new patterns for ourselves. And so one way that we've talked about doing that in our private conversations is through divine feminine work. So how do you see like the divine feminine as being, bringing us back into wholeness?
Yeah, I had this conversation. I just finished a course with a shamanic coach on peacemaking. And because the shamanic lineage I learned was Native American, and she was coming from a South American perspective. And I remember her mentioning something about the divine and sacred feminine and masculine, and the way they work in synergy with one another. Like really the masculine and feminine, I feel like they're kind of like the yin yang symbol, that we're supposed to be interdependent and synergistic and symbiotic, right? And if we're living in a patriarchal society, even though women have made created so much effort to like create equality and whatnot for ourselves through, I'm talking about the United States specifically, but I feel like this is for all of humanity. I don't know. I just had this realization that like we're trying to fit sort of the feminine aspect into a patriarchal system, and that just is not going to work. And I feel like the whole thing needs to fall apart in order for it to be recreated anew. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. We'll wait to hear what the listeners have to say.
Yeah, and like looking at what's happening in Ukraine, I feel like it's just like become blaringly obvious. Like we can't deny what we're seeing anymore, right? It's like so in our face that this is a person operating probably from his own generational trauma and trying to sort of relive a past that's already long gone, and using power to exert control against people who self-identify as a certain culture, and a people who just want to live autonomously in a democratic society and have freedom of choice. And that's how we feel as women, right? Like that's
Yeah.
all any human being wants. So
And it's
when
the toxic masculinity. We're not saying,
it's
I just want to clarify,
right,
it's not
yes,
men versus women. We're
no,
talking about
no,
like a toxic masculine
right.
approach.
Yeah, so we're all operating, if we're living in this society where there's this component where people are trying to control the autonomy of other people's desire to live free and as free and sovereign beings, that's coming from a wounded aspect. So as long as we're living in a society that's structured from the ideology of that wounded aspect, the feminine can't live in its divine nature either, because it's
Mhm.
operating from the wounded structure, because it's fragmented, and it's like our understanding of the feminine is through the lens of the wounded masculine, right? So
Mhm.
like both of those aspects, I feel like I had this realization just a couple weeks ago, like it all needs to go into shambles. I feel like that's what we're sort of seeing anyways,
Yeah.
like in around the globe. And I think it's really stressful and creating a lot of anxiety for people, because it seems like the world's going into chaos. Well, it has to go into chaos in order for things to fall apart.
Well, and I think about your own, when I asked you previously, in the first segment of the show, like, okay, what was like, if you're in this known perspective, why would you want to move out of the known? And what's
Yeah,
the catalyst? And the catalyst for you had to be like this extreme discomfort. And so as we
right.
want to see a global shift, there has to be mass discomfort in order for us to wake up and do all of our inner work.
That's such a good point. And that was the point that I'd forgotten about when we were sort of talking about that, was that sometimes it's the only way we know. It's the only thing we know. Like we're only living through these wounded, fragmented perspectives, and we don't know how to do it the other way. And that's what's terrifying, even though the current way that we're, operating is detrimental to us. We still want to hold on to it because it's a known thing, and it's scary to let go of what we know, even when it's damaging to us.
Well,
That's the
if we're never talking about, bringing in more of the divine feminine, and that's not to
truth.
say we're letting go of the masculine, everyone. It's just to say that we need to bring ourselves into wholeness.
Mhm.
What would that look like to bring in more of those aspects?
Yeah, so this is part of that teaching I learned from this teacher. Like in truth, the divine feminine is really the birther of life and the creator. And we need the masculine energy to create the environment to provide and support the birthing and creation of life. That's how the two work synergistically with one another. And I don't want to like misconstrue that and boil that down to like,
I know
it's
it's such a big concept, but
yeah, right. Like if you think about kind of how women operate now, like oftentimes women are the ones that are doing the providing and nurturing. Um, but there's some kind of like, I think we're all operating out of the wounded aspect. And really, I feel like we need to reverse that and take a look at ourselves and see where we are not taking care of ourselves. Where are we living out of fear? Where are we living in a space where we're trying to control others? It's like doing a lot of self investigating and looking, it all starts with us as the individual before there can
Mhm.
be this like societal change. And
Otherwise, if we
where are we?
don't,
Yeah,
we just start to repeat history again. And
yeah,
we might think that we're, moving from a different perspective, but if you haven't done the inner work, then chances are you're not.
yeah,
Even though your passion and your energy feels like that you can't like is supporting what you consciously want, but subconsciously there's a different driving
mhm,
force underneath that we have to
yeah.
examine.
Where are we
Um,
perpetuating or perpetuating um, old habits or creating damage and passing that along? And
yeah.
how are we doing that to ourselves? Like it's always starting within the
Mhm.
inside.
And that's really powerful during our time. We're talking about how, in Ukraine right now that, can almost represent the feminine, which is being,
Mhm.
their authority and self-authority is being taken away by this toxic masculine figure. And then we're feeling that in the United States right now too. Like we feel like for many women, I'm not going to say all women, but that we feel like our self-authority has been suddenly ripped away from us by a toxic patriarchal head. And
Yeah.
so, we feel kind of lost in that fearful state because we don't feel safe anymore. And that's what actually what the divine masculine, the healthy masculine is there to do, is provide that stability and that structure for the creative power of the woman to come through. And so if we don't have that, we need to find ways to create that for ourselves, starting with ourselves.
Yeah. Can I add something? A
Yeah.
significant point. One thing that was significant in my healing was realizing how much I was living in a victimhood state. And even though, oh shoot, like my parents were victims of war, and I was starting to internalize that and victimizing myself with my own emotional state. So even though we've been living in an oppressed society, we have to figure our way out of it. It's not our responsibility. It's not our fault, but it's up to us to make the changes that are necessary so that we can live freely.
Yeah. And so anyone that's, live streaming in the Facebook group, we're going to continue this conversation. But for now, for the live radio show, we're going to have to wrap it up. So thank you so much for being here, Anya. And Anya's on sabbatical right now, but if anyone wants to reach out to her, you can reach out to her through email at Anya, ANYA, at starhearthealing.com. That's Anya at starhearthealing.com. And I thank each and every one of you for showing up each week for yourself. And you are listening to Women Thriving Unapologetically on Voice America's Empowerment Channel. And we are here live every Thursday at 7 a.m. Pacific and 10 a.m. Eastern. And please remember to rate and review our show. Leave me a message, and I'd love to connect with you. Thank you so much.
All right, we're all clear. Awesome show you guys today.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Dave.
you.
Appreciate it.
No problem. Yeah, we'll talk to you next time, Lynsie. Take care.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Woo, that's a lot to cover in a
That's
short
a
amount
lot.
of time. That was amazing. And I didn't mean to throw you off a little bit with the one.
No, it's fine.
We got 1 minute.
I was like, oh, I need to bring this point in, because that really realizing how I was being victimized by my own emotions.
Yeah.
And continuing that story of victimhood was it's so hard to see your way out of it.
Yeah. And we could have a whole show just on that. And for those of you that are still watching and on YouTube and in the Facebook group, that we tend to do that. How many of you do that all the time, that we continuously perpetuate that we are the victim, like someone is doing something to us, or I feel like for myself personally, I would put myself into that state where it's all my fault, or what am I doing wrong? And then I would berate myself. I would yell at myself, really out loud scream at myself and say really bad things to myself because I was so frustrated. And then that in itself is creating even, that's the toxic masculine coming out on that's what happens when, in my opinion, that when a masculine gets distorted, we turn in on ourselves, that we don't even need someone outside of ourselves yelling at us or telling us or berating us or belittling us. We start to do it to ourselves. And that's a clear indication that we're not moving from a whole place. And that was so now when I do that to myself, I'm not in my whole being right now. I'm actually moving from that toxic masculine perspective again. And there is the toxic feminine too. So
I was going to add to that I had the experience of realizing that, for me, sabotage was an energy that was sort of intergenerational trauma of sabotage, always being in a sabotaging, life-threatening situation that's suddenly the rug's pulled out from under you and it's we need to call 911. But that I had internalized that, and that my own emotions were sabotaging me. Like I would have these emotional reactions that came out of nowhere. And it was like I was a victim of my own emotions.
Yes.
And I feel like that's how we learn to work with those energies, to shift them. It's just really like the thing that I learned from my yoga teacher was about stocking energy. Just start focusing and paying attention as if you're watching yourself like on a movie screen and seeing and witnessing your own reactions. And instead of judging yourself, being like, okay, what was the energy of that? And what is that showing me? And where is that coming from?
Yes.
And pulling, it's like pulling threads apart, it's like being a detective and a sleuth to kind of track the energy and like where it's guiding you to its source.
Yeah. And I love how you said we sabotage ourselves with
Mhm.
our own emotions. And that's not to say that our emotions are not valid, because this is like our emotions are like our power for women, but we want to make sure that um that they're not overwhelming us, or coming from that place where it is sabotaging us. Because I would get so, for example, like I would be so angry, like I would have rage, and that would
Me too.
overcome me to the point of sabotaging my relationships with other people, or my ability to do the work that I was meant to do, because I couldn't let go of it. And it was
Yes.
just like, and I felt like it was my power, but it was my distorted power.
Right.
And that's the toxic masculinity. Like I need to be angry. And I remember distinctly when I started doing the work of releasing that anger, actually through EMDR work, that what happened is that I was terrified, because I was like, I will no longer be powerful without my anger and my rage.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was like, who am I without this power? And I was like, oh, and that's when it took me a while to be like, oh, that's not real power.
Right.
A power of aggression and violence is not real power, but we've been taught that.
That's so
So
interesting, because I'm kind of reflecting on my own process of feeling victimized by my own emotions and like hijacked. And for me, that I also had rage and anger, but that was coming from a place of feeling like I'd been betrayed and sabotaged, which the source of that was fear. And again, that's fear of being left behind, fear of being left alone, and also not having control. Yeah, and I feel like it all sort of boils down to like not having authority, like feeling like your authority over yourself is being taken away somehow. And like you kind of know when that's going on, when you feel isolated and alone and like, you know, and that was also how I could track sort of my own feelings to and connect it to something that came before me, you know. So it's like starting to think about the stories I remember hearing about both my grandmothers, like not having their significant partners with them, and like the sudden dramatic changes they had to contend with in their lives. And it's like, oh, I'm mirroring that. That's happening in my life.
yeah, I think I mean, I feel like we could go on and on.
I know.
I mean, but I'm looking in the Facebook group now and seeing if there's any questions that anyone has for Anya right now. And just know that you can always put the questions in the comment section, and we will definitely make sure to get back to you. And again, if you want to reach out to Anya, you can reach out to her at anya@starhearthealing.com, and I'll put that in the comments below, and it'll also be in all the show notes on the YouTube channel. But what you could do to help out this show is to go to podcast platforms like iTunes and Spotify and Apple Podcasts, those places, and just rate and review the show, because that will actually let my executive producers know that you love it. And we'll do more of it. So Anya, thank you again so much for being here, and we'll have to have you on the show again, and just unpack even more of this. But I love you so much, and I appreciate you.
Too.
And thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back here next Thursday.
All right. Bye.